Okay.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is the palm actually facing upwards. What you can identify is the flexors of the actual wrist. So to identify the front part of the forearm, you can see the palm is actually facing up. You can identify your thumb. Here's your pinky side. So the first thing you have to identify is this tendon right here. This is the palmaris longus. So palmaris longus, you can see at the end of the tendon, it's pretty flat shaped at the end. So here's your palmaris longus. The muscle running on the thumb side, we call that the flexor carpi radialis or ulnaris. That would be the flexor carpi radialis because it's running along the thumb side, the actual radial side. So palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis. This is your flexor carpi ulnaris right here. So looking at the brachial region, so we have the biceps in the front, triceps on the back. Why do we call it the biceps brachii? We have two muscle bellies. Which one is lateral? This one's lateral because it's towards the thumb side, so we call this the long head of the biceps. This one is the short head of the actual biceps there. Next, what rotator cuff muscle are we looking at here? So this rotator cuff muscle is sitting in front of the actual scapula. We call this the subscapularis. So if you turn the forearm down, or the arm downwards, palm facing downwards, what you can identify is the extensors of the actual wrist. You can also identify the muscle which creates a high five motion extending the digits. So this muscle right here, we call that the extensor digitorum. So extensor digitorum, you can see it's going all the way to the actual digits. The extensor carpis, so the extensor carpi ulnaris is going to be right here. It's going to be running on the actual pinky side. Pinky side, the ulna bone is on the pinky side. So extensor carpi ulnaris, and then we have the extensor digitorum. One thing that I missed is if you turn the palm back up, we have a muscle which turns the palm downwards. This muscle right here, we call that the pronator teres muscle. So if you go towards the back, you can identify the extensor digitorum, extensor carpi ulnaris. All of these muscles back here in the back part of the arm, we call the triceps muscle. So let's go to the leg one next. So when you look at, this is the front of the leg, we can identify the quad muscles, the quadriceps muscles. To identify the quadriceps muscles, you want to find the kneecap. The quad muscle above the kneecap, we call that the rectus femoris. So kneecap, rectus femoris. If you look on the outer part of the leg, what do we call this white structure? That is the IT band, the iliotibial tracts. That's what tells us lateral versus medial of the leg. So rectus femoris, right above the kneecap, vastus lateralis, right by the IT band, so vastus lateralis, and then we have the vastus medialis. What muscle crosses from the outer hip to the outer knee? That crosses over the quad. That would be your sartorius muscle. So here's your sartorius, rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, that's your patella. What bone is this? That is, we tag that a lot, that is the tibia bone. So what muscle is right in front of the tibia? We call that the tibialis anterior. What muscle is running to the toes? All of this is your extensor digitorum longus. So if you look at the back of the leg now, you can identify the butt muscles. We have the gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, the iliotibial tracts, which is telling us that we're on the outer part of the leg. Well, you can identify the first hamstring, which is closest to the IT band. We call that the biceps femoris. Then we have the semitendinosus, which is right here. And then we have the semimembranosus. So biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and then semimembranosus. So what's the difference between the semitendinosus versus the membranosus? You can see this white line. That's what separates tendinosis from the semimembranosus. Next, looking at the calf region, we have the gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius will become a tendon we call the Achilles tendon, which attaches to the heel bone we call the calcaneus. Right underneath the Achilles tendon, you can identify the muscle deep we call the soleus, S-O-L-E-U-S. So gastrocnemius, Achilles tendon, and then the soleus right there. So let's head over to this next. So what we're actually looking at here is the shoulder blade we call the scapula. Front of the scapula, what you can see, this is the back of the actual scapula. So why is it the back? Because you can identify the scapular spine. So rotator cuff muscles, we have sits, S-I-T-S. The first S is above the spine of the scapula. We call the supraspinatus. Below the spine of the scapula, which is all of this, we call this the infraspinatus. So all of this on up is the infraspinatus. So that's SI. What is the T? This T is called the teres minor. So supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and then we have the teres minor. And then underneath, what is this muscle called? That is the teres major, which does not belong to the rotator cuff muscle. So right in front of the scapula, we call this the last rotator cuff muscle. That is the subscapularis. So that's right in front of the scapula. So subscapularis in the back, spine of the scapula, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and then the teres major. Looking at the head, what you can identify is we have the frontalis. What muscle is this wrapping around the eye? That is called the orbicularis oculi or the orbicularis oris. So this would be the orbicularis oculi. Around the mouth, what do we call that? That's called the orbicularis oris. The masseter is the main muscle to allow us to chew our food. That is going to be right here. Sternocleidomastoid, how can we identify that? Attaches behind the ear, wraps to the front of the actual clavicle, which isn't shown in the sternum. So sternocleidomastoid is all of this. So SCM, sternocleidomastoid, mastoid process, orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, and then the frontalis. Then if you move to this model, what you can identify, what do we call this muscle right here? That is called the deltoid muscle right here, which wraps all the way to the front. That's the most superficial. We call that the platysma. If you dissect the platysma out, what you will identify is this muscle called the sternocleidomastoid. If you work backwards, what do we call this right here? That is called the spine of the scapula. Upper trapezius is this muscle. You can see it's wrapping, starting at the base of the skull, wrapping to the top of the actual shoulders. What muscle is this? That's in the temporal region. This would be your temporalis muscle. If you take this apart, what you can identify is the nasal septum. When you identify the nasal septum, we have three different parts of the nasal septum. The front part we call the septal cartilage, which will be light blue. Then if you work a little bit backwards, we call that the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and then the sphenoid bone, and then here is your hard palate. Here's the frontal sinus, here is your sphenoidal sinus. If you look at this on the left, this is the lateral part of the nasal cavity. We have the inferior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and also the superior nasal concha or concha. Let's head over to this right here. What muscle is this? This would be your pectoralis major. If you dissect that out, you can identify the pectoralis minor, which attaches to the ribs. So on this model, we have the pectoralis major, and then dissect out to form the pectoralis minor. We have another muscle which is located in the armpit region. We call that the serratus anterior muscle. So looking at the six-pack muscles, how can we identify them? They're going to be right here. Can't really see them that much, but they will attach to the xiphoid process. If you go to this model, so we have the rectus abdominis. What do we call this muscle, which has horizontal fibers? That is the transversus abdominis. So pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, the rectus abdominis, and then the transversus abdominis. If you look back here, we have the deltoid, we have the spine of the scapula, we have the upper trapezius muscles. You can see we have the medial border of the scapula and the actual lateral border, which is not really shown. What you can see here above the spine, we have the supraspinatus, then we have the infraspinatus, and then the teres minor, and then the teres major. Looking at the butt muscles, what do we call this? This would be the gluteus maximus. With that, let's head over to the skeleton. So what do we call the breastbone? We call that the sternum. Top portion we have is the manubrium, body, and then xiphoid process. You can see how the collarbones meet up with the manubrium. We call these the clavicles. What is this projection right here called, which is projecting outwards? That is called the coracoid process. So if we have a left coracoid process, we must have a right coracoid process. Top of the shoulders, what do we call those? The acromion process. So when you look at the skull, we have the lower jaw, mandible, upper jaw, maxilla. You could see here is the angle of the mandible, and then we have the body of the mandible. Cheekbone, what do we call that? That's called the zygomatic bone. If you look at the skull, you can identify we have a suture, really not shown that well. We call the coronal suture, separates the frontal bone from the two parietal bones. We have a square-shaped suture that separates the parietal from the temporal, called the squamous suture. And the suture in the back, we call that the lambdoid suture, separates the occipital bone from the two parietal bones. And then you can see we have the sagittal suture, separating the left and the right parietal bone. If you look on the back, find the skull. What's the bone right underneath the skull called? That is called the atlas, also known as C1. This one is C2, also known as the axis. C2, if you look inside, it'll contain that vertical projection we call the actual dens. Then we have C3, 4, 5, 6, 7. How can we identify C3 through C7? You'll have openings in the transverse process. Next, what are these bones called right here, found where the ribs are at? This is the thoracic spine, which we have 12 of them. And then the low back, lumbar spine, we have 5 bones. Top of the pelvis, all of this we call the iliac crest. So iliac crest is the top of the hip bone or the pelvis. If you identify this, what bone is this? This is your sacrum. You can see we have a crest running vertical called the median sacral crest. If you see a vertical crest, you know this is the posterior openings, the posterior sacral foramen. If you have posterior sacral foramen, then you have openings in the front, which you can barely see. We call these the anterior sacral foramen. What is this where the pubic bones meet up? This is the pubic symphysis. Then the large openings, we have the obturator foramen. When you look at the thigh bone, what do we call the thigh bone? That is called the actual femur. How can you identify the femur? You can see this large projection going lateral. We call this the greater trochanter. So if you see a large projection, then automatically think, okay, you're looking at the thigh bone. We call it the femur. So here's the greater trochanter, and then you have a small bump on the inside. we call the lesser trochanter. Then all of this bone we call the actual femur. So when you look at the hand, we have 8 bones that make up the wrist. We can divide into 2 rows. The row closest to the radius and ulna we call the proximal row, and then the row furthest away from the radius and ulna we call the distal row. So first row that we have, the bone right here, we call that the scaphoid bone. This bone we have, we call the lunate. The bone that looks like a pebble sitting on top, pisiform. The bone underneath the pisiform, we call the triquetrum. So scaphoid, lunate, pisiform, triquetrum. Next bone that we have is this bone, trapezium. Then we have one tucked that's very small, trapezoid. Then we have a rectangle, capitate. And then we have the hook, we call the actual hamate. So trapezium, small trapezoid, and then rectangle capitate, and then the hook of the hamate. Here's your thumb, distal phalanx. This one will be tacked. We call that the proximal phalanx. So looking at the tibia versus the actual fibula, which one is larger? Here's the tibia. Here's the kneecap, we call the patella. Here is your tibial tuberosity. Here is the actual fibula. So here's the foot. What do we call the heel bone of the foot? This heel bone is called the calcaneus. So here's all of your calcaneus. Here is the actual talus. So heel, all of this is the calcaneus. And then the talus, you can see, is slightly sitting on top of the calcaneus. So calcaneus, talus. Then here's your big toe. So this is your medial part of your foot. We have this bone we call the navicular, and then cube-shaped bone we call the cuboid. Right in front of the navicular, you can identify the cuneiforms. We have the medial-most medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, and lateral cuneiform. So we have calcaneus, talus, navicular. These are the cuneiforms: medial cuneiform, intermediate, lateral cuneiform, and then the cuboid bone. So let's actually head over to the skull. Next one. So we can see here we have the pediatric skull. We have the soft spot of the skull. What do we call that? That's called the frontal fontanelle. So frontal fontanelle kind of looks pink. It's like a diamond type of shape. What bone are we looking at here? This is actually the maxilla or the mandible. This would be the lower jaw. We call the mandible. What you can see, we have the angle of the mandible, body of the actual mandible, which is your lower jaw. Looking at the skull, this is a real skull. What you can identify the large opening, we call the foramen magnum. We have side structures. We call those the occipital condyles. What you can see, these bumps right here and right here, we call these the mastoid process, which is behind the ear. What do we call this sharp process here and here, which is kind of broken off? That is the styloid process. So foramen magnum, occipital condyles, mastoid process, styloid process. Cheekbone, we call the zygomatic arch or the zygomatic bone. And then if you look inside the skull, this is the front. You can see, I can't see a frontal sinus, but normally you'll have a frontal sinus. What you have here is the large opening we call the foramen magnum. What is this structure right here called? This is the sella turcica. We have openings. What do we call the openings right in front of the sella turcica? That's called the optic canals. So sella turcica, optic canals, which we have 2 of them. And then we have the foramen ovale, oval shaped, and then the very small foramen spinosum. So sella turcica, optic canals, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, and then the foramen magnum. Then let's go to let's go to the actual real pelvis. What you can identify, we have the iliac crest, which is on the top. Here is the obturator foramen. Here's the pubic symphysis. What you can see here is the sacrum, median sacral crest. This is the posterior sacral foramen, and then the tailbone, which is actually broken off as the actual coccyx. Next, let's take a look at this right here. So practical purposes, we can have these bones actually outwards. Let's take a look at all these bones. So this bone, does it belong to C1 atlas or C2 axis? This would be C2 axis because you can see this vertical projection we call the dens. So this is C2, also known as the axis. So atlas was C1, axis is C2. Next that we have is the first bone that makes the cervical spine. We call this the ATLAS, also known as C1. So atlas, and then this one is the axis because of that vertical projection. Next, what bone or what part of the spine does this belong to? Looks like the thoracic spine because you have a long spinous process, but it actually belongs to the cervical spine because you can see these openings we call the transverse foramen. So if you see these transverse foramen, automatically come to conclusion that you're looking at the cervical spine. Vertebral canal, which we didn't really go over. This is the body of the vertebrae. If you look at the pedicle versus the lamina, pedicle is this portion connecting the body to the transverse process. So here's the pedicle, and then here is the lamina, which is actually between the transverse and spinous process. So this spinous process is projecting directly backwards. Transverse process is projecting to the actual sides. Then we have the body. So going back, we have atlas C1, axis C2 because of that dens, and this is C3 through C7 because of the openings in the transverse foramen. Next, how do we know the difference between this bone and this bone? So what you can actually see is if you look at the spinous process, which one is longer and going downward at an angle? That would be this one. You could see it's longer going at an angle. This is your thoracic spine. This one belongs to the lumbar spine. That spinous process is a little bit boxier and it's projecting a little bit more horizontally. Looking at this one, you can see we have the blood vessels. We call those the vertebral arteries that are running in the transverse foramen. This belongs to the cervical spine. And identifying the bones, what bone is this? You know, this is the actual sacrum. It's a fusion of bones. What bone is this? This is the shoulder blade we call the scapula. Spine of the scapula, acromion process. Supraspinatus fits into here, infraspinatus, and then teres minor. In front, subscapularis will sit in place. Here is the coracoid process. And that is it for the spine of the scapula. If you look at this bone right here, what bone is this? This is the actual humerus. For the humerus, you can identify the anatomical neck, which is wrapping around the humeral head, versus the surgical neck, which is wrapping around the shaft. What you can identify, we have a larger bump, we call that the greater tubercle. Smaller bump, we call the lesser tubercle, which belongs to the humerus. If you look at the other bones, what bone is this right here? How do we know what it is? You can identify a large projection going laterally. This is the thigh bone we call the femur. So you can see the femoral head, greater trochanter. If we have a greater trochanter, then we have a lesser trochanter. This is lateral, greater trochanter, and this is the actual thigh bone we call the femur. Looking at this bone right here, and let me actually get the other bone really quick. Let's look at this one. So radius versus ulna, how do we know the actual difference? When you look at the ulna, you can see we have a notch that is present. That notch we call the trochlear notch. On the other side of the trochlear notch, you can identify the point of the elbow. We call the olecranon process or the olecranon process. This bone right here is the actual ulna. The bone that I'm holding right here, we call this the radius. You can see how at the end of the radius it's flat but circular. That is the radial head. But practical purposes, we can have you just identify a bone. You know, okay, if you can identify this notch, this is automatically the ulna. Think of U-shaped notch as the ulna. And let's see what else. Last two bones that we actually have is the tibia versus the actual fibula. Which one is larger in diameter? The tibia. So here's the tibia right in front where you get kicked if you play soccer. We call that the tibial tuberosity. So here's your tibia. Fibula is going to be a lot less in diameter. So tibia, this one on the right is the actual fibula. And let's go over the foot and the hand just of the actual models. So what you can see when you look at the hand, we have the thumb side radius, pinky side ulna. So naming of the carpal bones, we have the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, and then we have the trapezium, that small trapezoid, rectangular capitate, and the hook we call the hamate. Radius, ulna, proximal phalanx, distal phalanx. When you look at the foot, so when you look at this foot, heel bone, all of this is the calcaneus. Here is the talus, navicular, cuboid. Right in front of the navicular, you have the medial cuneiform, intermediate, lateral cuneiform. And that is it.